Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. This was in 2016, but I remember every detail of that night as if it had just happened yesterday. The memory haunts me, visiting me in quiet moments when I least expect it. I go out in the woods just south of the town I live in pretty frequently, at least 4 or 5 times a year. The forest has always been my sanctuary, a place where the noise of everyday life fades away into nothing. This particular weekend, I had that familiar urge to get out and have some time alone, stronger than usual. Work had been grinding me down, and I needed the reset that only nature could provide. I quickly filled my backpack with the essentials: sleeping bag, tent, water, food for 2 days, matches, cooking utensils, my trusty pocket knife, and pepper spray that my sister insisted I carry. The drive to the trailhead took 40 minutes through winding country roads. I parked on the side of the road near the trees where I always did, grabbed my bag, and started the familiar 2-hour hike to my favorite camping spot. I honestly don't know if it was even an actual trail marked on any official maps. In all my years of coming here, I'd never encountered another soul on this path, which was exactly how I liked it. The woods weren't mountainous or dramatic in any way. Instead, they stretched out flat and endless, densely packed with oak and pine trees that created a canopy so thick that even midday sun struggled to penetrate completely. Perfect for a peaceful 1 or 2 day camping trip, though admittedly nothing more adventurous than that. The sameness of the trees could become disorienting if you wandered off the barely visible trail. I reached my usual campsite around 4 in the afternoon. The spot was unremarkable to anyone else, but perfect to me. A small clearing where the trees opened just enough to see patches of sky, with a ring of stones I'd arranged years ago for a fire pit. There were still a few hours until sunset, so I took my time setting up camp. The tent went up easily, muscle memory guiding my hands through the familiar motions. I gathered dry wood, arranging the kindling and larger branches in the pit with practiced precision. The fire caught quickly, orange flames dancing upward as I settled onto my portable camping chair. I relaxed and ate some trail mix, savoring the mix of nuts and dried fruit while enjoying the warmth of the fire against my face. Birds chirped their evening songs, squirrels rustled through the underbrush, and a woodpecker hammered somewhere in the distance. The forest was alive with its daily symphony. When the sun got lower, painting the sky in shades of amber and crimson, I added more sticks to the fire. I always found it fascinating how quickly the forest transforms from vibrant life to absolute stillness once darkness falls. The transition happened gradually, then all at once. First the birds quieted, then the insects, until finally even the wind seemed to hold back. I sat there listening to this profound quietness for only about 25 minutes after full dark had settled when a strange sound shattered the silence. Music. Not just any music, but something classical, formal, almost ceremonial in its composition. It drifted through the trees from somewhere far off, and it sounded exactly like an old record player, complete with the subtle crackling and slight warping that comes with aged vinyl. I stood up immediately, my body tense as I peered into the darkness toward the sound's origin. Was there another campsite nearby that I'd somehow never noticed? Maybe a group had decided to set up camp and was playing music, though the volume seemed excessive for casual listening. The melody continued, unchanging, repeating. I stayed at my campsite and just listened, trying to make sense of it. Minutes stretched on, 10, 20, 30 at least, and throughout it all the song never changed. The same classical piece played on endless repeat, its notes carrying through the dead air of the forest with unnatural clarity. The repetition was maddening. Every note, every crescendo, every pause happened exactly the same way each time. No variation, no human touch to suggest someone was actually controlling the music. Just the same haunting melody cycling endlessly through the darkness. After those 30 minutes of listening to that hypnotic loop, curiosity overcame caution. I needed to know what was happening, if only to quiet the growing unease in my stomach. Grabbing my flashlight, I started walking toward the sound, leaving the safety of my campfire behind. The beam of light carved a narrow tunnel through the darkness ahead of me, tree trunks appearing and disappearing like sentries as I passed. The walk felt longer than it should have. The music grew louder with each step, but the source remained invisible. My heart rate increased steadily, and I became acutely aware of how isolated I was. The forest seemed to press in closer, branches reaching across my path like grasping fingers. I realized with a sick feeling that I'd only brought my flashlight. My knife and pepper spray were back at camp. A stupid, potentially fatal oversight. The music volume suggested I was nearly on top of it. Maybe 30 or 40 feet away. Yet I saw nothing. No light from a fire, no glow from lanterns, no silhouettes of tents. Then my flashlight beam caught something unnatural, a large speaker, partially hidden behind a thick oak tree. It was ancient by modern standards, a boxy monstrosity from the early 2000s, with a scratched LCD display and buttons worn smooth from use. No other equipment, no camping gear, no signs of human presence, just this solitary speaker pumping classical music into the wilderness. I approached cautiously, found the power button, and pressed it. The silence that followed was somehow louder than the music had been. I didn't linger. Every instinct screamed danger as I hurried back through the darkness toward my camp. The forest felt different now, charged with malevolent potential. Branches I'd easily ducked under on the way out seemed to grab at my clothes and hair. Roots appeared beneath my feet where none had been before. My flashlight beam jumped erratically as I half-walked, half-jogged through the trees. Relief flooded through me when I spotted the orange glow of my campfire through the trees. But as I entered the circle of light, that relief curdled into dread. Something felt wrong, fundamentally altered about my campsite. My eyes darted around, cataloging my belongings, trying to identify what had changed. The tent was still there. My backpack remained where I'd left it. The fire continued to burn steadily. Then it hit me like ice water. Things were missing. I dropped to my knees beside my pack, frantically searching through it. My matches for starting fires gone. My cooking utensils vanished. Most terrifying of all, both my knife and pepper spray had disappeared. Someone had been here while I was away. Someone had gone through my things with deliberate purpose, taking only the items I might use to defend myself or survive. My hands shook as I stood up, scanning the darkness beyond my small circle of firelight. They were out there, watching. I could feel eyes on me, studying my reaction, enjoying my fear. I didn't hesitate. Grabbing what remained of my belongings, I shoved everything haphazardly into my pack. My fingers fumbled with zippers and straps, made clumsy by adrenaline. As I worked, the music started again. The same classical piece, but closer now, much closer. Not from where I'd found the speaker originally, but perhaps only 100 feet away, hidden in the darkness. The sound seemed to come from multiple directions, as if more speakers had been activated, surrounding my campsite. I abandoned any pretense of packing properly. Slinging my half-open backpack over my shoulder, I ran for the trail. Behind me, the campfire continued to burn, a beacon I was abandoning to whatever lurked in these woods. The music followed me initially, seeming to move through the trees parallel to my path, but gradually faded as I put distance between myself and the campsite. 15 minutes down the trail, my flashlight beam caught something that made me skid to a stop. There, laid out in perfect alignment across the center of the path, were my missing items. The knife, pepper spray, matches, and utensils had been arranged with obsessive precision, each item exactly parallel to the others. A display, a message, a trap. I stood frozen, staring at my belongings spread across the trail like an offering. My hand reached out instinctively toward the pepper spray, the thing I wanted most in that moment. But before my fingers could close around it, I heard them footsteps, mazurfo of them, crashing through the underbrush behind me. Not trying to be quiet anymore, not trying to hide. The pretense was over. I turned my flashlight back up the trail, the beam revealing nothing but empty path and pressing darkness. But the footsteps were getting closer. Branches snapping, leaves rustling with violent movement. More than one person, I was certain. They'd been watching, waiting for me to reach their carefully placed trap. I ran. Left everything on the ground and ran harder than I'd ever run before. My legs pumped frantically, my backpack bouncing painfully against my spine with each stride. The flashlight beam bounced wildly, offering split-second glimpses of the trail ahead. Behind me, the footsteps continued, matching my pace, maintaining the distance between us. They weren't trying to catch me, I realized with growing horror. They were hurting me, controlling my movement, pushing me toward some predetermined end. For 10 minutes I sprinted at full speed, my lungs burning, legs screaming in protest. When I couldn't run anymore, I shifted to a desperate jog, then a fast walk, always moving, never stopping. The footsteps had ceased at some point, but I didn't dare slow down or look back. Every shadow could hide a person. Every sound might signal an ambush. The 2-hour hike to my campsite took less than 45 minutes on the return journey, fear providing fuel my body shouldn't have had. When I finally burst out of the tree line onto the road, I nearly sobbed with relief. My car sat exactly where I'd left it, untouched, beautiful in its mundane normalcy. I threw myself inside, locked all the doors, and started the engine with shaking hands. As I pulled away, I allowed myself one glance in the rearview mirror. At the edge of the forest, barely visible in the red glow of my taillights, stood 3 figures. They didn't move, didn't wave, just watched as I drove away. I've never returned to that forest. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear classical music in my dreams. The same piece playing over and over. I've tried researching the area, looking for similar incidents, but found nothing. Whatever happened that night, whoever those people were, they're still out there, still setting their traps, still hunting their prey. I was lucky. I escaped. But I know, deep in my bones, that others haven't been so fortunate. The forest keeps its secrets, and I pray to God that those secrets stay buried in the darkness between the trees, far from the world of the living. Back in 2012, when my mates and I were in our mid-20s, we thought we had life figured out. 3 of us worked dead-end jobs in Birmingham, spending our weekends in the same pubs, telling the same stories, living the same routines. When September rolled around that year, we started planning our annual celebration for our friend's birthday. I'll call him Birthday Boy to protect his privacy, though God knows he'd probably prefer the notoriety. Birthday Boy had always been the adventurous one among us, while the rest of us, myself, Chris, and Martin, were content with our urban comforts. He'd been pushing for something different. Every year prior, we'd done the predictable thing. Newcastle, Manchester, sometimes London if we were feeling flush. Clubs, drinks, the usual debauchery that passes for celebration when you're young and aimless. But that September evening, sitting in our local pub with condensation from our pints pooling on the scratched wooden table, Birthday Boy dropped his bombshell. I want to go camping in Wales for my birthday. The way he said it, firm and decisive, told us this wasn't a suggestion up for debate. October camping in Wales. The very thought made me shiver, knowing how the Welsh weather could turn vicious that time of year. The preparation consumed us for weeks. None of us had proper camping experience beyond childhood scout trips that we'd mostly forgotten. We spent evenings researching equipment, watching survival videos on YouTube, studying weather patterns. Chris became obsessed with fire-starting techniques, practicing in his back garden until his neighbors complained about the smoke. Martin focused on navigation and first aid, while I took charge of location scouting, poring over maps and satellite images of Wales, searching for the perfect spot. We settled on a location near a lake in mid-Wales, accessible by train, and then a moderate hike. The satellite images showed a clearing near the shoreline, surrounded by woodland, with what looked like decent flat ground for camping. A country lane ran about a mile from the site, providing access without being too close to civilization. It seemed ideal, isolated enough for a proper wilderness experience, but not so remote that we'd be completely cut off if something went wrong. The train journey on that October morning was filled with nervous energy. We'd loaded ourselves with gear, tents, sleeping bags rated for cold weather, cooking equipment, enough food for 2 nights, and probably too much alcohol considering we had to carry it all. The weather was exactly as predicted. Gray skies threatening rain, wind that cut through our jackets, temperatures hovering just above freezing, but our spirits were high, bolstered by cans of cheap lager and the excitement of doing something different. The walk from the train station took us through a small village, then down progressively narrower roads until we reached a country lane that wound between hedgerows. The landscape was quintessentially Welsh, rolling hills dotted with sheep, ancient stone walls dividing fields, patches of woodland that looked like they'd stood there for centuries. The lake wasn't visible yet, hidden by the terrain, but we could smell water on the wind, that distinctive mineral scent mixed with decaying vegetation. About halfway down the lane, we came upon a small cottage, its stone walls covered in ivy, smoke rising from the chimney. An elderly man was working in the front garden, pulling weeds from between rows of late-season vegetables. He straightened as we approached, his weathered face studying us with an expression I couldn't quite read. His hands caked with soil, gripped a rusty trowel. I nodded in greeting, and he asked where we were headed. When I pointed down the lane and mentioned camping by the lake, his expression shifted. Not quite alarm, but something close to it. He looked us over more carefully. 4 city boys loaded with brand new camping gear, obviously out of our element. "I wouldn't go down there if I were you lads," he said, his Welsh accent thick. "The shores of that lake are haunted." The way he said it, matter of fact, without any theatrical flair, made it somehow more unsettling. When I asked how he managed living so close to these supposed ghosts, he simply pointed to a small wooden cross above his doorframe. "You don't strike me as believers," he added. Birthday Boy, who'd been raised Catholic and still attended Mass occasionally, spoke up. "Actually, I am a believer." The old man's smile was thin, almost pitying. "Well, at least one of you will be all right then. The rest of you I can't speak for." Martin, ever the joker, made an exaggerated ghost sound. "Whoa," which sent us into laughter. But the old man didn't join in. He just maintained that unsettling smile and said, "Mark my words, boys, you'll see." We walked away still chuckling, dismissing him as a local eccentric trying to spook tourists. But I noticed Birthday Boy glancing back several times, and Chris had gone quiet, which was unusual for him. The lake appeared suddenly as we crested a small rise. It was larger than the satellite images had suggested, its dark waters stretching perhaps 2 miles across, surrounded by dense woodland that came right down to the rocky shore in places. The water was absolutely still, like black glass reflecting the overcast sky. No birds sang, no insects buzzed. The silence was complete, broken only by our footsteps and labored breathing from the hike. We found a relatively flat area about 100 meters from the shoreline, covered in thick moss that would provide some cushioning. The ground felt springy underfoot, almost bog-like in places, but it seemed stable enough. We set up our tents in a rough square formation, with space in the middle for a fire pit. The work kept us warm and distracted from the oppressive quiet of the place. As darkness fell, we got a fire going using the techniques Chris had practiced. The flames brought life to our little camp, pushing back the darkness that seemed particularly dense here. We cooked sausages and beans, burned some marshmallows, and gradually worked through our beer supply. Birthday Boy seemed to relax as the evening wore on, the initial creepiness of the place fading with alcohol and companionship. But even with the fire and conversation, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about this place. The darkness beyond our fire seemed absolute, swallowing our torch beams when we ventured out to relieve ourselves. The lake remained perfectly still. No waves, no ripples despite the wind we could hear in the trees above. It was as if the water was too heavy to move, weighted down by something beneath its surface. Around midnight, rain began to fall, gentle at first, just a patter on our tent fabric. We retreated to our sleeping bags, tired from the day's exertion and slightly drunk. I remember lying there, listening to the rain gradually intensify, thinking how cozy it was to be warm and dry while nature raged outside. The moss beneath my tent made for surprisingly comfortable bedding. I drifted off to the sound of water drumming on nylon. I woke in complete darkness to an unpleasant sensation, dampness seeping through my sleeping bag. My first thought was that I'd somehow wet myself, which would have been mortifying. But as consciousness fully returned, I realized water was coming in from outside. The bottom of my tent was soaked, and when I pressed my hand to the ground, water squeezed up through the moss like a sponge. I checked my phone 5:47 a.m. Still dark outside, but I could hear the others stirring, presumably discovering the same problem. We emerged from our tents into pre-dawn gloom, rain still falling steadily. Our campsite had transformed into a shallow pond. The moss that had seemed so perfect for camping was actually a natural sponge, and we'd pitched our tents in what amounted to a drainage basin. Chris was furious. "Brilliant location scouting," he spat at me, wringing water from his sleeping bag. "Absolutely brilliant. We're sleeping in a bloody swamp." He had every right to be angry. I'd chosen the spot based on satellite images without considering drainage or flood potential. Birthday Boy was more philosophical about it, but Martin was shivering violently, his tent having taken the worst of the water. We stood there in the rain, soaked and miserable, trying to decide what to do. Chris wanted to abandon the trip entirely, find a bed and breakfast, and head home on schedule. "This is ridiculous," he kept saying. "We're not survivalists. We're idiots from Birmingham playing at being outdoorsmen." Birthday Boy disagreed strongly. He wanted to find another campsite, dry off, and continue as planned. "It's my birthday trip," he argued. "One setback doesn't mean we give up." The argument escalated quickly. Exhaustion, cold, and discomfort made us all short-tempered. Chris and Birthday Boy were nearly shouting at each other, their voices echoing across the still lake. That's when Martin, who'd been quietly smoking a cigarette and watching the argument with growing disgust, announced he was going for a walk. "If you two are going to argue like little kids," he said, pulling a pre-rolled joint from his tobacco tin, "I'm going to find somewhere dry to have a smoke in peace." He held up one of the walkie-talkies we'd brought, cheap things from an electronics store that we'd thought might be useful. "Don't worry, I'm just one click away if you need me." And with that, he walked off into the gray dawn, heading toward the country lane we'd come down the day before. We continued arguing for probably another 20 minutes before exhaustion and the futility of it all made us stop. By then, weak sunlight was filtering through the rain clouds, giving everything a sickly yellow tinge. We agreed to at least pack up our sodden gear and find somewhere drier to regroup. "Better call Martin back," Birthday Boy suggested, the fight gone out of his voice. I clicked the walkie-talkie. "Martin, mate, we're packing up. Come back and give us a hand, yeah?" Static. I tried again, thinking maybe he was out of range or had his earbuds in, listening to music while he smoked. "Martin, you there?" Nothing but static. The first tendrils of worry began to creep in. Martin was reliable, not the type to ignore us out of spite. I tried several more times over the next 10 minutes, each unanswered call ratcheting up our anxiety. Chris took the radio from me, thinking maybe I wasn't operating it correctly, but got the same result: dead air. We hurriedly packed our wet gear, shaking out the worst of the water, and headed in the direction Martin had gone. The path he would have taken was obvious. There was only one route to the lane, unless he decided to bushwhack through the woods, which seemed unlikely. As we climbed away from the lake, we gained elevation, and could see the entire area where we'd camped. No sign of Martin anywhere. The landscape was empty except for a few sheep in distant fields. We started calling his name, our voices carrying across the valley, but received no response. We tried his mobile repeatedly, but there was no signal. The isolation that had seemed romantic yesterday now felt threatening. Where could he have gone? The walk to the lane was 15 minutes at most, and he'd been gone for nearly an hour. We found a decent camping spot on higher ground, a small clearing in a patch of woodland well above any flood risk. We dropped our packs there but didn't set up camp. Finding Martin was the priority. We spread out to cover more ground, staying within shouting distance of each other. I was searching along a tree line when I heard Chris yelling for us. The panic in his voice made me run. I found him standing in a small clearing, his face pale, the walkie-talkie gripped in his white-knuckled hand. Chris was struggling to speak. "What? What did he say?" Birthday Boy demanded, having arrived seconds after me. Chris swallowed hard. He said, "Let me out." Just that. "Let me out." Over and over. The words hung in the air. I wanted to believe Chris was joking, but his expression was deadly serious. He looked genuinely terrified. "Maybe you misheard," Birthday Boy suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. "Maybe he said something else." Chris shook his head emphatically. It was clear as day. His voice, but wrong somehow, distorted. And he paused, searching for words. He sounded like he was in pain, or terrified, or both. We stood there in the woods, rain still falling, trying to make sense of it. If Martin was in trouble, serious trouble, we needed help. But who would believe us? And more importantly, where was he? The walk back to the lane felt like hours, though it was probably only 20 minutes. We needed phone signal to call for help. Every shadow in the woods seemed threatening now. Every sound potentially significant. The walkie-talkie remained silent despite our constant attempts to reach Martin. We were fortunate that a van came along the lane relatively quickly. The driver, a local farmer, took one look at our panicked faces and let us pile into the back without question. He drove us several miles to where we could get phone signal, refusing our offers of payment. Chris made the emergency call, his voice shaking as he explained the situation to the dispatcher. She was professionally calm, taking Martin's details and then putting us on hold. Those few minutes of waiting felt like an eternity. When she came back on the line, her tone had changed slightly. Less concerned, more routine. "I've found your friend," she said. "Martin Red Hair, correct? He's been arrested. He's being held at Abergavenny police station." The relief was immediate but confusing. Arrested? For what? When? How? The journey to Abergavenny was surreal. We retrieved our gear, hiked back to the train station and took the first available train, all while speculating about what could have happened. Had Martin gotten into a fight? Had he been caught trespassing? Nothing made sense. We found him in a pub near the police station, nursing a pint and looking thoroughly embarrassed. The story he told was both mundane and bizarre. After leaving us, he'd walked to the lane to find somewhere dry to smoke his joint. He'd found a tree stump that looked suitable for sitting but was soaked from the rain, so he just walked up and down the lane instead, smoking and trying to stay warm. He was just finishing his joint when he heard a vehicle approaching. Thinking it was just a local farmer, he hadn't been concerned until the police car rounded the bend. Martin, 6'3", red dreadlocks, wearing a purple jacket, massive joint hanging from his mouth at 6:46 in the morning, was exactly the sort of person to attract police attention. He'd run, stupidly, which had turned simple possession into resisting arrest. They'd caught him within 50 yards, cuffed him, and taken him to the station for processing. During the arrest, the walkie-talkie had fallen from his jacket, lost in the scuffle. "But I never used the radio," Martin insisted when we told him about the message Chris had received. "I never said let me out, or anything else. I walked, I smoked, I got nicked, that's it." We sat in that pub until closing time, going over the events again and again. Martin swore he'd never transmitted anything over the radio. Chris was equally certain about what he'd heard. A male voice, distorted but recognizable as Martin's, pleading to be let out. The rational explanation we settled on was interference. Someone else with a radio on the same frequency, playing a prank. Maybe they'd heard us calling for Martin and decided to have some fun at our expense. The old man at the cottage had tried to scare us with ghost stories. Perhaps this was more of the same. Locals having a laugh at tourists. But there were problems with this theory. The timing was too perfect. Just when Martin had genuinely disappeared. Just when we were most vulnerable to fear. And the voice. Chris remained adamant that it had sounded exactly like Martin, just distorted somehow, as if coming from very far away or through water. We never went back to that lake. We never even looked it up properly when we got home, as if knowing more about it might make the experience worse somehow. We still meet up every year for Birthday Boy's birthday, but we stick to cities now. Comfortable hotels, predictable nights out. Sometimes late at night I think about that voice on the radio. Was it really just a prank? Or was there something about that lake? Something the old man knew, something that had tried to communicate with us through our cheap walkie-talkie. I tell myself it was just coincidence, just bad luck and worse weather, but I've never forgotten the absolute stillness of that water. The way the darkness seemed to press in on our little camp. The feeling that we were being watched by something that didn't appreciate our presence. And sometimes, in the small hours when rational thought feels fragile, I wonder what would have happened if Martin hadn't walked toward the lane that morning. If he'd stayed by the lake, alone in the dawn mist, with no police to accidentally save him from whatever was calling out "let me out" through our radio. We'll never know, and perhaps that's for the best. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. Some questions better left unasked. But if you ever find yourself camping near a Welsh lake, and the locals warn you away, maybe you should listen. Maybe they know something you don't. Maybe those still, dark waters hold more than just fish and water weeds. Maybe something's down there, waiting, wanting out. My name is Ezra Finch, and this happened to me back in 2014. I was living in a small town in Montana, a place called Three Forks. Population 1,869 on a good day. The kind of place where everyone knows your business before you do, and the biggest excitement usually comes from the high school football games on Friday nights. I worked as a handyman, fixing things around town, and I like to think I was pretty good at it. 23 years I'd been at it, ever since I graduated high school and decided college wasn't for me. Life was simple, and I enjoyed it that way. I had a routine that suited me fine. Up at 6, coffee strong enough to wake the dead, then whatever jobs Mayor Hopkins or the townsfolk had lined up for me. Leaky faucets, squeaky doors, broken steps, nothing I couldn't handle with the right tools and a little patience. Most evenings you'd find me at the local bar, the Rusty Nail, sharing a drink and a laugh with whoever walked in. The Nail wasn't much to look at. Dim lighting, scratched wooden tables, and a jukebox that had seen better decades, but it was ours. It was where the town came together, where news traveled faster than wildfire, and where you could count on finding a familiar face no matter how rough your day had been. That particular Friday night in October, I found myself at my usual spot at the bar, nursing a Coors and chatting with my friend Jack Milner. Jack was the town's only mechanic, a big burly guy with hands like ham hocks and a booming laugh that could shake the windows. We'd known each other since high school, played on the same football team, and he was the closest thing I had to family after my parents passed a few years back. The bar was quieter than usual that night. Old Pete was in his corner booth, methodically working through his third whiskey. Sarah, the waitress, was wiping down tables with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been doing it for decades. The usual Friday night crowd seemed smaller, subdued somehow. "You hear about the new folks moving into the old Henderson place?" Jack asked, taking a long swig of his beer. His voice carried that tone he got when he had gossip worth sharing. The Henderson place. Just hearing the name made me shift uncomfortably on my bar stool. That Victorian house had been empty for going on 8 years, ever since old Mrs. Henderson died and left it to some distant relatives who never bothered claiming it. The place had a reputation even before it sat empty. Kids said it was haunted, adults said it was cursed, and everyone agreed it gave them the creeps. "Yeah, heard they bought it cheap," I replied, trying to keep my voice casual. "Place has been empty for years. Kind of surprised anyone would want it." Jack leaned closer, lowering his voice to what he probably thought was a whisper, but still carried halfway across the bar. "Apparently there's some kind of religious group, one of those communal living things. Bought it sight unseen, cash deal." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "Religious group?" "That's what I heard from Maggie at the real estate office," Jack said, shaking his head. "Strange folks, if you ask me. Showed up in 3 black vans, all dressed the same. Didn't say much, just handed over the money and took the keys." I shrugged, trying to dismiss the unease that was creeping up my spine. As long as they don't cause trouble, I don't see why it matters. Everyone's got a right to live where they want. Jack grunted in agreement, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. "Maybe so, but there's something about that place, Ezra. Always has been. My grandmother used to say the land was sour, that nothing good would ever come of it. Your grandmother also thought the moon landing was fake and that Elvis was hiding in Billings," I pointed out, forcing a laugh. "Yeah, well, she was right about the Petersons' marriage falling apart, and she called the bank closure 6 months before it happened," Jack countered. Woman had instincts. We moved on to other topics after that. The upcoming deer season, whether the Broncos had any chance this year, Jack's ongoing battle with his ex-wife over alimony payments. Normal stuff, safe stuff. But I couldn't shake the image of 3 black vans rolling through town, or the feeling that something had shifted in Three Forks, like a stone thrown into still water. I should have paid more attention to that feeling. Later that night, walking home from the Nail under a sky so clear the stars looked close enough to touch, I found myself taking the long way around town, not consciously avoiding anything, just enjoying the crisp October air and the familiar sights of my neighborhood. But when I reached the corner where Elm Street branched off toward the Henderson place, I stopped. The house was maybe 2 miles down that road, hidden behind a screen of pines and birch trees. From where I stood, I couldn't see even a hint of it. But I could feel it somehow, like a weight pressing against the back of my skull. The trees seemed darker down that way, the shadows deeper. A dog barked somewhere in the distance, then another, then several more, their voices joining in a chorus that raised the hair on my arms. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the barking stopped. The silence that followed was complete, absolute. I turned and walked home, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me go. The call came on a Tuesday morning, 2 weeks after my conversation with Jack at the Rusty Nail. I was in my workshop behind the house, trying to resurrect an ancient lawnmower that Mrs. Peterson insisted was worth saving, when the phone's shrill ring cut through the quiet. Ezra. Mayor Hopkins's voice crackled through the receiver, sounding more strained than usual. I need you to head out to the Henderson place. They've got some issues with the plumbing, and you're the best we've got. I felt that familiar cold settle in my gut. The new folks?
That's right. Fellow named Samuel called this morning. Says they've got a backed up drain system, maybe worse. Could be a real mess if it's not handled soon.
I found myself hesitating, which wasn't like me. Work was work, and the Henderson place was just another house when you got right down to it. Sure thing, Mayor. I'll head over there this afternoon. Appreciated, Ezra. And, Hopkins paused, and I could hear him drumming his fingers on his desk the way he did when he was nervous. Be professional, you know? These folks are new to town, and we want to make a good impression. When am I not professional? I asked, but Hopkins had already hung up. The drive to the Henderson place took me about half an hour, winding through farmland and forest on roads that got progressively narrower and more isolated. I'd driven out this way a few times over the years, once to fix a generator for old Henderson himself, another time to help with some tree damage after a bad storm, but it had been at least 5 years since I'd made this trip. The house sat in a natural clearing, surrounded by woods that seemed to press in from all sides. It was a Victorian, built sometime in the 1890s when the railroad money was flowing, and people had grand ideas about taming the wilderness. 3 stories of dark wood and gingerbread trim, with a wraparound porch and windows that looked like watching eyes. Even in its heyday, it had been an imposing place. Now, after years of neglect, it looked downright menacing. The paint was peeling in long strips, revealing gray wood underneath. Shingles were missing from the roof, and the porch sagged in the middle like a broken spine. The yard, once carefully maintained, had grown wild with weeds and volunteer trees. But as I pulled up the gravel driveway, I realized the new owners had been busy. The worst of the overgrowth had been cleared away, and scaffolding lined one wall where someone had been working on the siding. 3 black vans were parked near the house, the same ones Jack had mentioned, I assumed. More unsettling were the people I could see moving around the property. There were maybe a dozen of them, all dressed in the same dark, plain clothing. They moved with purpose but without speaking, like actors in a silent film. Even from a distance, there was something mechanical about their movements, something that made my skin crawl. I grabbed my toolbox from the truck bed and approached the front door. Before I could knock, it swung open to reveal a tall, thin man with gaunt features and the most piercing blue eyes I'd ever seen. He was maybe 50, with prematurely gray hair and skin that looked like it rarely saw sunlight. "Mr. Finch," he said in a voice like rustling leaves. It wasn't a question. "I am Samuel. Thank you for coming." "Just Ezra is fine," I said, offering what I hoped was a friendly smile. "Understand you've got some plumbing troubles." Samuel nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving my face. "Indeed. Please follow me." He led me into the house, and I immediately understood why the Henderson place had such a dark reputation. The interior was dimly lit, with heavy curtains blocking most of the natural light. The air felt thick and oppressive, carrying the smell of old wood, mildew, and something else I couldn't identify, something organic and unpleasant. The furniture was sparse and utilitarian, nothing like the ornate Victorian pieces you'd expect in a house like this. Instead, there were simple wooden chairs and tables, all arranged with mathematical precision. The walls were bare except for a few religious symbols I didn't recognize, not crosses or stars of David, but geometric patterns that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. "The problem is in the basement," Samuel said, leading me toward a door I hadn't noticed at first. It was painted the same dark color as the walls, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. We descended a narrow staircase into a basement that was larger than I'd expected, extending under what must have been the entire house. The ceiling was low, forcing me to duck in places, and the walls were rough stone that wept moisture. A single bare bulb provided the only light, casting harsh shadows that seemed to dance with every small movement. The smell down here was worse. That same organic odor but stronger, mixed with something metallic that made my mouth water in an unpleasant way. I tried to breathe through my mouth as Samuel led me to a utility room where the house's plumbing converged. "Here," he said, pointing to a floor drain that was indeed backed up. Dark water had pooled around it, and the smell was coming from whatever was causing the blockage. Shouldn't take too long, I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. I'll have this fixed in no time. Samuel nodded again. I will leave you to your work. As soon as he was gone, I felt some of the tension leave my shoulders. There was something about the man that put me on edge. The way he stared without blinking, the careful precision of his words, the feeling that he was evaluating every move I made. I got to work with the drain snake, trying to clear whatever was causing the backup. The blockage was stubborn, and I had to put my full weight behind the tool to make any progress. When it finally gave way, a rush of dark water surged up from the drain, carrying with it chunks of organic matter that I tried not to examine too closely. That's when I heard it. A faint whisper, barely audible over the sound of draining water. It seemed to be coming from somewhere deeper in the basement, beyond the circle of light from the single bulb. I stopped working and listened, but the sound had stopped. Just the pipe settling, I told myself, but my voice sounded thin and unconvincing in the confined space. I finished the job as quickly as I could, testing the drain to make sure it was flowing properly. The water ran clear now, carrying away the last traces of whatever had been blocking it. But the smell lingered, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. As I packed up my tools, I heard it again, that whisper, soft and sibilant, like wind through dry leaves. This time I was sure it wasn't the pipes. I turned toward the sound, peering into the darkness beyond the utility room. "Hello?" I called out, feeling foolish even as I did it. No response. Just that oppressive silence that seemed to press against my eardrums. I climbed the stairs quickly, eager to get out of that basement and back into something resembling natural light. Samuel was waiting for me in the kitchen, standing so still he might have been carved from stone. "The problem is resolved," I said, wiping my hands on a rag. "Drain was backed up with debris, but it's flowing clear now. Shouldn't give you any more trouble." "Excellent," Samuel said, reaching into his pocket and withdrawing an envelope. "Your payment." I took the envelope without opening it, tucking it into my shirt pocket. "If you have any other problems, don't hesitate to call." "We appreciate your discretion," Samuel said, and there was something in his tone that made it sound less like a comment and more like a warning. I made my way back to my truck as quickly as I could without running, all too aware of the eyes I could feel watching me from the house's dark windows. It wasn't until I was back on the main road, the Henderson place disappearing behind the trees, that I allowed myself to relax. But even then I couldn't shake the memory of that whisper in the basement, or the feeling that I'd seen something in the shadows that my mind refused to process. Something that explained the smell, and the strange behavior of the people at the house, and the way my skin had crawled from the moment I'd set foot on the property. That night at the Rusty Nail, I told Jack about the job, but I found myself editing the story, leaving out the more unsettling details. Just strange people being strange, I told him, nothing more. But as I walked home that night, I found myself looking over my shoulder more than usual, and I made sure to lock my doors before going to bed. The first disappearance happened 3 days after my visit to the Henderson place. Lisa Thompson was the town librarian, a quiet woman in her mid-30s who lived alone in a small house near the elementary school. She was the kind of person who faded into the background, pleasant enough but unremarkable, the sort you might not notice unless you needed help finding a book or renewing a library card. When she didn't show up for work on Thursday morning, the assistant librarian, Carol Hendricks, assumed Lisa was sick and called her house. No answer. By afternoon, Carol was worried enough to drive over and check on her. Lisa's car was in the driveway. Her mail was overflowing from the box, and no one answered the door. Sheriff Nolan found the house unlocked. Lisa's purse on the kitchen counter, her keys on the table by the door. No signs of struggle, no indication of where she might have gone. It was as if she had simply vanished into thin air. Probably went to visit family, people said. Had some kind of emergency and forgot to tell anyone. But Lisa had no family to speak of, and even if she had, she wasn't the type to leave without making arrangements for the library. The town was unsettled, but not yet panicked. People disappear sometimes, even in small towns, maybe especially in small towns, where the isolation can drive folks to desperate measures. Then Bill Evans went missing. Bill was a retired farmer, 72 years old and stubborn as a mule. He lived by himself on 10 acres outside town, tending a small garden and complaining about the government to anyone who would listen. His nearest neighbor, Mrs. Kowalski, noticed his mail piling up on Friday. By Saturday, she was concerned enough to call Sheriff Nolan. They found Bill's house the same way they'd found Lisa's. Door unlocked. No signs of struggle. Personal belongings undisturbed. His old pickup truck was in the driveway, keys in the ignition. A half-eaten sandwich sat on the kitchen table, the bread gone stale but not moldy. Now the town was scared. 2 disappearances in 4 days was more than coincidence, especially when both scenes showed the same impossible characteristics. People started looking over their shoulders, checking their locks twice, keeping their children close. The Rusty Nail, usually busy on weekend nights, was nearly empty. Even Jack seemed subdued when I met him there on Saturday evening. "What do you think happened to them?" he asked, nursing a beer that he'd barely touched. I shook my head. "No idea. Sheriff have any leads? If he does, he's not sharing them." Jack leaned closer, lowering his voice even though we were practically alone in the bar. "But I heard something interesting from my cousin Danny. He works for the power company, does meter readings." "Yeah?" "Says he was out by the Henderson place yesterday, and he saw something strange. Smoke coming from behind the house like they were burning something big. But when he got closer to check the meter, the smoke stopped, and he couldn't see any fire. A chill ran down my spine. Could have been anything. Burning brush, trash, whatever." "Maybe," Jack said, but he didn't sound convinced. "Danny said the smell was wrong, though. Not like burning wood or leaves. More like..." He trailed off, looking uncomfortable. "Like what?" "Like meat," Jack finished quietly. We sat in silence for a moment, both of us probably thinking the same thing, but neither wanting to voice it. Finally, Jack cleared his throat. "Probably nothing," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Just folks being paranoid. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, thinking about smoke and strange smells and people who disappeared without a trace. Every small sound made me tense. The house settling, wind in the trees, a cat yowling somewhere in the distance. I found myself thinking about the basement at the Henderson place, about the whisper I'd heard, and the feeling of being watched. Around 3 in the morning, I gave up on sleep and went to the kitchen to make coffee. As I waited for it to brew, I pulled out the envelope Samuel had given me and counted the bills inside. $200 for a job that shouldn't have paid more than $50. Why had they overpaid so much? And what had Samuel meant about appreciating my discretion? I was still puzzling over these questions when someone knocked on my door. The sound was so unexpected at that hour that I nearly dropped my coffee mug. I stood frozen in the kitchen, listening to my heart pound, as the knocking came again, soft but insistent. "Ezra Finch." The voice was female, young and terrified. "Please, I need your help." I approached the door cautiously, peering through the peephole. A young woman stood on my porch, pale and shaking in the porch light. She looked to be in her early 20s, with long dark hair and wide, frightened eyes. I didn't recognize her. "Who are you?" I called through the door. "My name is Emily," she said, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "I need to talk to you about the Henderson place." My blood went cold. I unlocked the door and opened it, keeping the chain engaged. "What about it?" "Please," she said, her voice breaking. "They're looking for me. I don't have much time." Against every instinct screaming at me to keep the door locked, I let her in. She was wearing dark clothing similar to what I'd seen at the Henderson place, but it was torn and dirty, as if she'd been running through the woods. Her hands were scratched and bleeding, and there were leaves in her hair. "Thank you," she said, collapsing into one of my kitchen chairs. "I wasn't sure you'd believe me." "Believe what?" I asked, pouring her a cup of coffee. Her hands shook as she wrapped them around the mug. "That they're dangerous," she whispered. "The people at the Henderson place, they're not what they seem." I sat down across from her, trying to keep my voice calm. "What do you mean?" Emily took a shaky sip of coffee, then looked directly at me with eyes that held too much pain for someone so young. "I was part of their group. Samuel found me in Billings 6 months ago when I was living on the streets. He promised community, purpose, a family. I was so desperate." She trailed off, staring into her coffee cup. "Go on," I said gently. At first it seemed wonderful. Everyone was so kind, so welcoming. They took care of me, gave me clean clothes, decent food, a place to belong. But gradually, things changed. The rules became stricter, the punishments harsher, and the teachings. Emily shuddered, wrapping her arms around herself. Samuel preaches about transcendence, about shedding the corrupt flesh to achieve spiritual purity. He says the outside world is poison, that only through sacrifice can we cleanse ourselves and reach enlightenment. What kind of sacrifice? I asked, though I was afraid I already knew the answer. Human sacrifice, she whispered. He believes that by taking the life of the impure, the corrupt, we can absorb their essence and purify it. The missing people, Lisa Thompson, Bill Evans, they're not missing, they're dead. The words hit me like a physical blow. I'd suspected something was wrong at the Henderson place, but this was beyond my worst fears. I tried to leave before, Emily continued, but they caught me. Samuel said I was too valuable to lose, that I had a special role to play in the final ritual. He kept me locked in the basement for 3 days, telling me about his vision of purification, of the great cleansing that was coming. How did you escape? Tonight was supposed to be another ceremony. They drugged my food to make me compliant, but I managed to hide most of it under my tongue and spit it out later. When they took me to the basement, I was awake enough to fight. I managed to get away, but they're looking for me. They'll never stop looking. I stared at her, part of me wanting to dismiss her story as the ravings of a traumatized young woman. But I remembered the whisper in the basement, the overpayment, Samuel's warning about discretion. Too many pieces fit together. We need to call the police, I said. Emily shook her head frantically. They won't believe me. Samuel is careful. He's convinced everyone in town that we're just a harmless religious group. And besides, by the time the police investigate, they'll have moved the evidence. They're very good at cleaning up. Then what do you want me to do? She leaned forward, grabbing my hand with fingers that were ice cold. Help me gather proof. You've been inside the house, you know the layout. We can get evidence that even the police can't ignore. Every rational part of my mind screamed that this was insane, that I should call Sheriff Nolan immediately and let him handle it. But I kept thinking about Lisa Thompson and Bill Evans, about the whisper in the basement and the smell of something burning behind the Henderson place. If they really are killing people, I said slowly, why haven't they killed you? Emily's face went pale. Because I'm not meant to be killed, she whispered. I'm meant to be the killer. Samuel has been training me, preparing me for the final ritual. He says I have the purity of spirit needed to complete the cleansing. The next sacrifice is supposed to be made by me, to prove my worthiness. When? Tomorrow night, Halloween. I felt the blood drain from my face. Halloween was still considered a pagan holiday by many religious groups, a time when the barrier between the living and dead was thinnest. If Samuel truly believed in his twisted doctrine, it would be the perfect night for his final ritual. All right, I heard myself saying. We'll get your proof. We waited until after midnight, before making our move toward the Henderson place. Emily had spent the day hidden in my workshop while I went through the motions of normalcy, fixing Mrs. Patterson's leaky faucet, replacing a broken window for the Methodist church, nodding politely when people asked if I'd heard anything new about the missing people. Every interaction felt surreal, like I was playing a role in a play I didn't understand. How could people go about their daily routines when a cult of killers was operating just miles away? But then again, they didn't know what Emily and I knew. They hadn't heard her story or seen the terror in her eyes. As the sun set on Halloween night, Three Forks looked like any other small town preparing for trick-or-treaters. Jack-o'-lanterns glowed on porches, fake cobwebs draped from trees, and children in costumes ran from house to house with bags of candy. The normalcy felt obscene. Emily had barely eaten all day, spending most of her time staring out the workshop window at the tree line, as if expecting Samuel and his followers to emerge from the forest at any moment. When I asked if she wanted to back out, she shook her head firmly. They have to be stopped, she said. I won't let anyone else die because of my cowardice. We drove to within a mile of the Henderson place, then abandoned my truck on a logging road and continued on foot. Emily knew the property well, guiding us through the woods along deer paths that kept us hidden from the main driveway. The moon was nearly full, providing enough light to navigate but also making us feel exposed whenever we had to cross open ground. As we got closer to the house, we could see lights in the windows. More lights than I'd seen during my plumbing visit. The black vans were still parked near the front entrance, but now they were joined by several other vehicles I didn't recognize. More people have arrived, Emily whispered, for the ceremony. We crept closer, using the overgrown landscaping as cover. Through the windows, I could see figures moving around inside the house, all dressed in the same dark clothing I'd seen before. But tonight, their movements seemed different, more purposeful, more ritualistic. The basement entrance is around back, Emily said, pointing toward the rear of the house. There's an exterior door that leads directly down. That's how they bring in the... She didn't finish the sentence, but I understood. That's how they brought in their victims. We circled around to the back of the property, staying well within the tree line. The rear of the house was darker, with only a few windows showing light. But what caught my attention was the smell. That same organic odor I'd noticed during my plumbing job, but stronger now, mixed with something that made my stomach turn. There, Emily pointed to a set of concrete steps leading down to a heavy wooden door. That's the entrance to the ritual chamber. The ritual chamber. Not just a basement, but a place specifically designed for Samuel's twisted ceremonies. I felt sick thinking about what had happened down there, about Lisa and Bill and whoever else had disappeared over the months. We approached the exterior door carefully. To my surprise, it wasn't locked. But then again, who would be stupid enough to break into a cult's stronghold? Besides us, apparently. The door opened onto a narrow staircase that descended into absolute darkness. I brought a small flashlight, but I was reluctant to use it in case the light was visible from inside the house. We descended slowly, feeling our way along the rough stone walls. The smell grew stronger as we went deeper, and I had to breathe through my mouth to keep from gagging. At the bottom of the stairs, we found ourselves in a corridor I hadn't seen during my previous visit. This part of the basement was separate from the utility room where I'd worked on the drain. Emily grabbed my arm, her grip tight enough to bruise. "This way," she whispered, leading me toward a faint light visible around a corner. What we found defied my worst fears. The ritual chamber was a large room carved from the living rock beneath the house. The walls were covered with symbols painted in what looked like dried blood. Not the geometric patterns I'd seen upstairs, but something older, more primitive. Candles provided the only light, casting dancing shadows that made the symbols seem to writhe and move. In the center of the room stood an altar made from rough-hewn stone, its surface stained dark with substances I didn't want to identify. Around the altar, the floor was marked with a complex pattern of circles and lines, also painted in what appeared to be blood. But it was the objects arranged around the room that made my breath catch in my throat. Personal belongings. A purse I recognized as Lisa Thompson's, Bill Evans's worn baseball cap. Other items that must have belonged to victims I didn't even know about yet. Trophies, proof of Samuel's crimes. "My God," I whispered, pulling out my phone to take pictures. The camera flash seemed blindingly bright in the dark chamber, and I winced, expecting alarms to sound or footsteps to come running. Instead, we heard voices from somewhere above us, chanting in a language I didn't recognize, the words rising and falling in a hypnotic rhythm. "They've started," Emily said, her face pale in the candlelight. "The ceremony has begun." I took as many photos as I could, documenting every angle of the chamber, every piece of evidence. The chanting grew louder, and now I could hear footsteps on the floor above us, moving in a pattern that suggested some kind of procession or dance. "We need to get out of here," I said, but Emily was staring at something in the far corner of the chamber that I hadn't noticed before. It was a cage, roughly welded from steel bars, just large enough to hold a person. And inside, Jesus, I breathed. The figure huddled in the cage was barely recognizable as human. Emaciated, filthy, wearing rags that might once have been clothing. At first I thought it was a corpse, but then I saw the slight rise and fall of its chest. "Tom Hendricks," Emily whispered. "He was a drifter who came through town about 2 weeks ago. Samuel said he was perfect for the final ritual because no one would miss him. Tom Hendricks." I remembered him now. A vagrant who'd been sleeping in the park until Sheriff Nolan moved him along. I'd seen him panhandling outside the grocery store, and like most people, I'd looked the other way. Now he was going to die because of our collective indifference. "We have to get him out," I said, moving toward the cage. "Ezra," No, Emily grabbed my arm. If we try to free him now, they'll know we were here. They'll disappear, destroy the evidence, and we'll never be able to prove what they've done. She was right, but that didn't make it any easier to look at the broken man in the cage and walk away. I took more photos, including several of Tom Hendricks, then forced myself to turn toward the exit. That's when we heard the footsteps on the stairs. Someone was coming down to the ritual chamber, and we were trapped. The only exit was the way we'd come in, and whoever was descending would see us the moment we tried to leave. Emily pointed frantically toward a shadowed recess behind the altar. We dove for cover just as the footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs, pressing ourselves against the cold stone wall and trying to control our breathing. 3 figures entered the chamber, all wearing dark robes with hoods that obscured their faces, but I recognized Samuel's voice when he spoke. "Everything is prepared," he said to his companions. "The vessel awaits, and the instrument of cleansing is ready. Tonight we complete the great work." One of the other figures moved to the cage and unlocked it, dragging Tom Hendricks out with surprising gentleness. The poor man was so weak he could barely stand, swaying like a reed in the wind as they positioned him near the altar. "Where's the girl?" Samuel asked. "Still missing," one of his followers replied. "But we have searched everywhere. She cannot have gone far." "She must be found," Samuel said, his voice carrying a cold fury that made my blood freeze. "Without her, the ritual is incomplete. She is the chosen one, the pure vessel through which the cleansing must flow. Perhaps we should postpone." "No." The word cracked like a whip. "Too much has been sacrificed to reach this moment. We will proceed as planned. If the girl cannot be found, then we will improvise." The followers began arranging candles around the altar in a specific pattern, while Samuel opened what looked like an ancient book and began reading from it in that same unknown language we'd heard upstairs. The chanting grew louder, more insistent, and Tom Hendricks began to whimper. I looked at Emily, whose face was white with terror. We both knew we were witnessing the preparation for a murder, and there was nothing we could do to stop it without revealing ourselves. Even if we tried to intervene, we were outnumbered and trapped in a room with only one exit. But I couldn't just watch a man die. I was about to spring from our hiding place when Emily grabbed my wrist, her nails digging into my skin. She shook her head frantically, pointing upward. I could hear what she'd noticed. More footsteps above us, moving toward the basement stairs. How many people were in this house? How large was Samuel's cult? The ritual continued, building toward some terrible climax, when suddenly the sound of sirens shattered the night air. Police sirens, getting closer fast. Samuel's chanting stopped abruptly. "What is that?" The sirens were close now, right outside the house. Car doors slammed, and I could hear shouting voices. Sheriff Nolan's among them. "We have been betrayed," Samuel said, his voice deadly calm. "Gather the sacred items. We must leave immediately." His followers moved with practiced efficiency, collecting candles, ritual implements, and the mysterious book. Within minutes, they had cleared most of the evidence from the chamber. "What about him?" one of them asked, pointing to Tom Hendricks. Samuel looked at the broken man with cold calculation. "Leave him. He is too weak to speak coherently, and without the other evidence, his ravings will be dismissed as the fantasies of a damaged mind." They fled up the stairs, leaving Tom Hendricks collapsed beside the altar. Above us, I could hear running footsteps, doors slamming, and the sound of vehicles starting up. Emily and I emerged from our hiding place as the sound of the cult's vehicles faded into the distance. Tom Hendricks was unconscious but breathing, and I could hear Sheriff Nolan's voice upstairs, calling for us to come out with our hands visible. "How did they know to come?" I asked Emily as we helped Tom to his feet. She smiled weakly. "I called them before we left your place. Anonymous tip about suspicious activity at the Henderson place. I figured even if we didn't find evidence, at least the police would be here to investigate." Smart girl. Smarter than me, certainly. We made our way upstairs, supporting Tom between us, and emerged to find the house surrounded by police cars and emergency vehicles. Sheriff Nolan stood in the front yard, looking grim and tired. "Ezra," he called out when he saw me. "What the hell are you doing here?" "Long story, Sheriff," I said, "but you're going to want to see what's in that basement." The next few hours passed in a blur of questions. statements and controlled chaos as law enforcement processed the scene at the Henderson place. EMTs took Tom Hendricks to the hospital, where doctors said he would eventually recover but would need weeks of care to undo the damage of his captivity. Sheriff Nolan examined the photos on my phone with a mixture of horror and professional skepticism. Even with most of the ritual implements gone, enough evidence remained in the basement chamber to confirm Emily's story. The symbols painted on the walls, the stained altar, the personal belongings of the missing people. It painted a picture that was impossible to dismiss. "Christ, Ezra," Sheriff Nolan said, shaking his head as he scrolled through the images. "Why didn't you come to me first?" "Would you have believed us?" I asked. "Without proof?" He was quiet for a long moment, then sighed. "Probably not. Sam seemed like a normal guy when I met him. Weird maybe, but not dangerous." The cult had vanished completely, leaving behind only the house and 3 abandoned vehicles. Samuel and his core followers had apparently escaped in other cars, probably stored off-site for exactly this kind of emergency. A statewide APB was issued, but I had a feeling they were already far away. Emily spent the night at the hospital for observation, exhaustion and dehydration finally catching up with her now that the immediate danger had passed. I gave my complete statement to the state police investigators who arrived the next morning, then finally went home to try to process what had happened. The media descended on Three Forks like a plague of locusts. News vans lined Main Street. Reporters interviewed anyone willing to talk, and our quiet little town became the center of a national story about cult activity and ritual murder. The attention was overwhelming and deeply unwelcome. Jack found me at home 2 days later, looking haggard and shaken. "Jesus. Ezra," he said, slumping into one of my kitchen chairs. "I can't believe this was happening right under our noses." "None of us could have known," I said, though the words felt hollow. There had been signs. The isolation of the cult, their strange behavior, the mysterious disappearances. If we'd been more vigilant, more willing to look past the surface, maybe Lisa Thompson and Bill Evans would still be alive. "The FBI found evidence of at least 6 murders," Jack continued. "Bodies buried in the woods behind the house. Some of them have been there for months. 6 murders. 6 people who had trusted Samuel's promises of community and purpose, only to become victims of his twisted beliefs." The thought made me sick. "What about Emily?" Jack asked. "How's she holding up?" "Better than you'd expect," I said. Emily had shown remarkable resilience, working with investigators to provide details about the cult's operations and helping them understand Samuel's psychological manipulation techniques. "She's talking about staying in Three Forks permanently. Says she wants to help the community heal." Over the following weeks, more details emerged about Samuel's cult. They had been operating for over 2 years, moving from town to town whenever local authorities got too interested. Three Forks was supposed to be their final stop, the place where Samuel would complete his great work and achieve the spiritual transcendence he preached about. The FBI profiler assigned to the case explained that Samuel was a classic cult leader, charismatic, manipulative, and utterly convinced of his own divine mission. He recruited vulnerable people like Emily, isolated them from outside influences, then gradually broke down their psychological defenses until they would do anything he asked. "The scary thing," the profiler told me during one interview, "is how normal these people can seem on the surface. Samuel passed background checks, had no criminal record, presented himself as a legitimate religious leader. If not for your actions and Miss Emily's courage, he might have continued killing indefinitely." The investigation eventually wound down, with Samuel and his core followers still at large but the immediate threat eliminated. Life in Three Forks slowly returned to something resembling normal, though the shadow of what had happened would always linger over our community. Emily kept her word about staying in town. She found work at the local diner and gradually became a part of our community, though I could see the trauma in her eyes whenever someone mentioned the Henderson place. We grew closer over the months that followed, bonded by our shared experience and the knowledge that we had looked evil in the face and lived to tell about it. The Henderson place itself stood empty once again, though now it was officially condemned and scheduled for demolition. The local government wanted to erase all traces of what had happened there, to reclaim the land and build something positive in its place. I supported that decision. Some places carry too much darkness to ever be truly clean again. One evening in early spring, about 6 months after the events at the Henderson place, Emily and I sat on my porch watching the sunset paint the Montana sky in shades of orange and gold. The worst of the media attention had died down, and Three Forks was learning to be a quiet small town again. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't let me in that night?" Emily asked. I considered the question. Tom Hendricks would be dead. Maybe others too, if Samuel had found more victims. The cult would still be out there somewhere, continuing their killing. And if they had caught me before I reached your house, "Don't think about that," I said firmly. "You were brave enough to escape, smart enough to find help, and strong enough to see it through. That's what matters." Emily smiled, but I could see the sadness that never quite left her eyes. Surviving Samuel's cult had saved her life, but it had also cost her the innocence that most people her age took for granted. She would always carry the knowledge of what humans were capable of when they surrendered their moral compass to a charismatic leader. "Have you heard anything new about the investigation?" she asked. I shook my head. FBI thinks Samuel and his people are probably hiding out somewhere in Canada or Mexico by now. They had this planned out too well to get caught easily. The thought that Samuel was still out there, possibly rebuilding his cult and finding new victims, was a constant source of anxiety for both of us. But there was nothing more we could do except hope that law enforcement would eventually track him down. "I had another nightmare last night," Emily said quietly. "About the basement. About what would have happened if we'd been caught down there." "That's normal," I said, though I'd been having my own nightmares about the ritual chamber and the terrified man in the cage. "Maybe you should talk to someone. There are counselors who specialize in this kind of trauma." "Maybe," she said, but I could tell she wasn't ready for that step yet. Emily was strong, but she was also stubborn, convinced that she could work through her psychological wounds on her own. We sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Three Forks spread out below us, peaceful and ordinary, showing no signs of the horror that had briefly taken root here. Children rode their bicycles through the streets, families gathered on their porches, and the warm glow of windows promised safety and normalcy. But I knew that beneath the surface, our community had been forever changed. We had learned that evil could wear a friendly face and speak in soothing words. We had discovered that the most dangerous predators were often those who promised salvation while delivering damnation. The experience had also taught us something else, though. That ordinary people could find extraordinary courage when it mattered most. Emily had risked everything to escape Samuel's control and warn others. I had set aside my natural caution to help a stranger in need. Together, we had done what needed to be done, even when it meant facing our worst fears. "Ezra," Emily said, breaking the silence. "Yeah? Thank you for believing me, for helping me, for everything." "Thank you for having the courage to knock on my door," I replied, "and for trusting me with the truth." She leaned against my shoulder, and we watched the lights of Three Forks twinkle in the gathering darkness. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new mysteries, new opportunities to choose between comfort and courage. But tonight, we were safe, and we were together, and we had survived something that should have destroyed us. In the distance, I could see the dark outline of the ridge where the Henderson place sat empty and condemned. Soon it would be gone, reduced to rubble and memories, and something new would take its place. But I would never forget what had happened there, or the lesson it had taught me about the thin line between civilization and chaos. Life in Three Forks went on, as life always does, carrying its mixture of joy and sorrow, hope and fear, love and loss. But now it carried something else as well, the knowledge that when darkness threatened our community, we had found the strength to stand against it. And if it ever came again, we would be ready. This happened to me on February 2nd, 19... Back then I was still pretty green, working as a patrol officer in sleepy little Willowbrook, Tennessee. Population 3,847, according to the faded welcome sign that probably hadn't been updated since the Carter administration. A town so quiet the biggest scandal in years was a dispute over Miss Ellie's award-winning pecan pie recipe at the county fair, with accusations of industrial espionage involving the Methodist Church Bake Sale Committee. I'd been on the force for just 8 months, fresh out of the police academy in Nashville, full of textbook knowledge but short on real experience. Chief Morrison had hired me partly because I was young and eager, but mostly because the pay was so low that experienced officers kept leaving for better opportunities in Knoxville or Chattanooga. Willowbrook Police Department consisted of exactly 4 officers, including the chief, operating out of a converted storefront that had once been Paulson's Hardware before Old Man Paulson retired to Florida. The town nestled in a valley surrounded by the foothills of the Great Smoky Mountains, connected to the outside world by a 2-lane highway that most travelers used as a shortcut between larger cities. Main Street featured the usual collection of small-town businesses: Murphy's General Store, the Dixie Diner where the coffee was always too strong and the pie too sweet, Garrett's Auto Repair, no relation, despite what folks assumed, and the First Baptist Church where Reverend Hayes delivered fire and brimstone sermons to a congregation that grew smaller each winter as the elderly passed and the young moved away seeking opportunities. Most of my shifts involved routine patrols, writing the occasional speeding ticket, and responding to domestic disputes that usually resolved themselves by the time I arrived. The most excitement I'd seen was breaking up a fight at Murphy's when 2 hunters got into an argument over deer hunting territories. I'd started to wonder if I'd made a mistake leaving the city for this backwater assignment. Then came the disappearances, and everything changed. It started with old Mr. Thompson, a cantankerous widower who lived alone on a rambling property bordering the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Ezra Thompson was 73 years old, a retired railroad worker who'd bought 40 acres of mountain land back in the 60s with dreams of raising cattle. The cattle venture had failed, but Ezra had stayed, becoming something of a hermit. His nearest neighbor was Mrs. Kowalski, a widow who lived a quarter-mile down the mountain road, and she was the one who reported him missing. "Haven't seen hide nor hair of him in 3 weeks," she told Chief Morrison when she came into the station. "Usually see him checking his mailbox every other day, regular as clockwork. But the mail's been piling up and his truck hasn't moved from the driveway." Chief Morrison and I drove out to Thompson's place on January 15th. The property was accessed by a gravel road that snaked through thick stands of oak and hickory, bare branches creating a skeletal canopy overhead. The house was a modest 2-story affair that had seen better days, with peeling white paint and a front porch that sagged under the weight of accumulated junk, old appliances, rusted farm equipment, stacks of newspapers yellow with age. The front door was unlocked, which wasn't unusual in Willowbrook where most folks still didn't see the need for security. Inside, the house had the stale smell of bachelor living, unwashed dishes in the sink, clothes draped over chairs, the lingering odor of cigarette smoke and canned soup. But there were no signs of struggle, no indication of foul play. Thompson's wallet was on the kitchen table beside his keys. His truck sat in the driveway with the keys in the ignition. "Probably just wandered off into the woods," Chief Morrison said, lighting one of his ever-present Marlboros. "Old-timers like Ezra sometimes get confused, lose track of where they are. Happens more than you'd think." We organized a search with volunteers from town and park rangers from the Smokies. For 3 days, teams combed the forest behind Thompson's property, following game trails and creek beds, calling his name until our voices were hoarse. We found nothing. No footprints, no torn clothing caught on branches, no indication that Ezra Thompson had ever set foot in those woods. The search was called off after a week. The official report listed Thompson as a missing person, probable cause listed as disorientation due to age-related confusion. The case file went into the inactive drawer, and life in Willowbrook returned to its usual quiet rhythm. Then just last week, Jenny Carlisle disappeared. Jenny was 17, a junior at Willowbrook High School, who worked afternoons at the Dixie Diner after classes. She was everything Ezra Thompson wasn't. Young, vibrant, popular with her classmates, planning to attend the University of Tennessee in the fall to study nursing. Jenny had dreams of seeing the world beyond the mountain valleys, of building a life in places where things actually happened. On January 25th, Jenny finished her shift at the diner at 6 o'clock, same as always. She was scheduled to close up, which meant wiping down tables, washing the last of the dishes, and making sure the coffee pot was turned off. Marge Henley, the diner's owner, usually stayed to help with closing, but that evening she'd left early to drive her mother to a doctor's appointment in Knoxville. Jenny said she didn't mind closing alone, Marge told us later, tears streaming down her weathered face. She'd done it plenty of times before. Sweet girl, responsible as they come, always left everything spotless. Jenny's parents expected her home by 7:30. When she hadn't arrived by 8, her father Tom drove to the diner. The building was dark, Doors locked, everything properly secured. Jenny's yellow Volkswagen Beetle was gone from the parking lot. Tom called the police, and I was the one who took the report. We found Jenny's car 2 days later, parked on a Forest Service road that branched off Highway 441 about 5 miles north of town. The vehicle was undamaged, keys still in the ignition, purse on the passenger seat containing her wallet, makeup, and $37 in cash. There was no note, no sign of mechanical trouble, no indication why Jenny had stopped on that isolated stretch of road. Search and rescue teams combed the woods for days. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation sent agents from Knoxville. Volunteers from 3 counties joined the effort, including tracker dogs that followed scent trails that seemed to vanish at the edge of the tree line. We found not a single trace of Jenny Carlisle, no footprints, no torn clothing, no personal belongings. It was as if she had simply evaporated. The community was shaken in a way I'd never seen. Parents started keeping their children indoors after dark. The few businesses that stayed open past sunset hired security guards from Gatlinburg. Rumors spread like wildfire through the coffee shops and church socials. Talk of serial killers, drug dealers, even suggestions that something supernatural was stalking the mountains around Willowbrook. I wanted to dismiss it all as small-town hysteria, but there was an uneasiness settling over the community that I couldn't shake off. It was more than just concern about missing persons. There was something primal about the fear, something that touched the deepest part of the human brain, where ancient memories of being hunted still lingered. Folks were getting spooked, and honestly, so was I. During my patrols, I found myself checking my rearview mirror more often, paying closer attention to the shadows between the trees. The mountains that had once seemed like peaceful guardians now felt watchful, harboring secrets in their dark hollows and hidden valleys. I chalked it up to bad luck initially. Rural communities deal with missing persons more often than people realize. We get lost hikers who underestimate the dangers of the backcountry, teenagers who run away to the big city, elderly folks who wander off and succumb to the elements. The Great Smoky Mountains had claimed lives before: heart attacks on steep trails, hypothermia during unexpected weather changes, the occasional bear encounter gone wrong. But 2 disappearances in less than a month was unprecedented for Willowbrook. And there was something about the way both people had vanished completely without a trace, as if they had never existed at all, that gnawed at the edges of my consciousness like a persistent toothache. The mountains seemed different now, more ominous. When I drove the rural routes on my evening patrols, the forest pressed closer to the road than I remembered. The silence felt heavier, broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustle of something moving through the underbrush. Sometimes I caught myself holding my breath, listening for sounds I couldn't name, watching for movement in my peripheral vision. There was a prickling at the back of my neck that I couldn't quite shake off. A primitive warning system that had kept our ancestors alive when things with teeth and claws stalked them in the darkness. That feeling would prove prophetic, though I had no way of knowing it at the time. The 3rd call would come soon enough, and with it, the night that would change everything I thought I knew about the quiet little town of Willowbrook and the ancient secrets hidden in the shadow of the Smoky Mountains. I was working the night shift when the call came in, February 2nd, just past midnight. The station was quiet except for the static hiss of the radio and the occasional crackle from dispatch in Sevierville. Chief Morrison had gone home hours earlier, leaving me to handle whatever came up during the graveyard shift, which, in Willowbrook, usually meant nothing more exciting than checking on the businesses along Main Street, and maybe writing a report about Miss Henderson's cat getting stuck in her neighbor's tree again. I'd been reviewing the files on Thompson and Jenny Carlisle, spreading the photos and witness statements across my desk like pieces of a puzzle that refused to come together. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows that made the faces in the photographs look gaunt and haunted. Jenny's school photo showed a pretty girl with bright eyes and an optimistic smile. Thompson's driver's license photo revealed a grizzled face weathered by decades of mountain living, eyes that held the stubborn independence common to folks who chose solitude over society. The radio crackled to life, startling me from my brooding thoughts. Unit 3. We have a possible prowler at 247 Maple Ridge Road. Caller reports suspicious activity on her property. Are you available to respond? I recognized the address immediately. The Whitaker Place, on the edge of town where the suburban development gave way to forest. Harold and Betty Whitaker were in their 60s, retired and generally kept to themselves. I'd been to their house once before, about 6 months ago, when a windstorm had knocked a tree across their driveway and they'd needed help getting it moved so Harold could get to his doctor's appointment. Unit 3 responding. I radioed back, already reaching for my keys and jacket. ETA approximately 15 minutes. The drive to Maple Ridge Road took me through the quiet streets of Willowbrook, past darkened houses where honest folks were tucked safely in their beds. A few streetlights cast pools of yellow light on empty sidewalks, and my headlights illuminated the occasional cat slinking across the pavement on some nocturnal mission. The suburban section of town ended abruptly at a wooden sign that read, "Entering Great Smoky Mountains National Park, Protected Wildlife Area." Maple Ridge Road was a narrow, winding lane that climbed steadily into the foothills. During the day, it offered spectacular views of the valley below, but at night it felt like a tunnel through hostile territory. Ancient oaks and hickories pressed close to the pavement, their bare branches creating a canopy that blocked out the stars. My headlights swept across their trunks as the road curved, creating a strobe effect that made shadows dance and shift. A thick fog had rolled in from the mountains, the kind of heavy mist that clung to everything and seemed to muffle sound. By the time I reached the Whitaker driveway, visibility had dropped to maybe 20 feet. I could barely make out the dim outline of their ranch-style house through the swirling gray curtain. I parked behind Harold's pickup truck and sat for a moment, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness beyond my headlights. The fog moved in lazy patterns, sometimes revealing glimpses of the house, sometimes obscuring it entirely. There was something unsettling about the way it seemed to shift and flow with purpose, as if it were alive. The silence was wrong. That was the first thing I noticed as I stepped out of the patrol car. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a sleeping suburb, but rather the oppressive silence that falls over a forest when every living thing is holding its breath, waiting for danger to pass. No crickets chirped in the grass. No owls called from the trees. Even the ever-present rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush was absent. I approached the house cautiously, flashlight cutting through the swirling fog. The beam illuminated shifting wisps of mist, but little else. My footsteps on the gravel driveway seemed unnaturally loud, each crunch echoing off the surrounding trees. Harold Whitaker met me at the front door before I could knock, his shotgun clutched in hands that shook with either cold or fear. He was a big man, thick through the shoulders from years of construction work before retirement. But tonight he looked smaller somehow, diminished by whatever had driven him to arm himself in his own home. "Thank God you're here, Officer Garrett," he whispered, gesturing frantically toward the tree line behind his house. His voice carried the tight control of a man trying not to panic. "There's something out there, something that ain't natural." I followed his gaze toward the back of the property, where the manicured lawn gave way to dense forest. The fog was thicker there, creating a wall of gray that seemed to pulse and breathe in the night air. "What did you see, Mr. Whitaker?" I asked, keeping my voice calm and professional despite the growing unease in my gut. Betty Whitaker appeared in the doorway behind her husband, wrapped in a faded pink bathrobe, her gray hair disheveled from sleep. Her eyes were wide with terror, and she clutched at Harold's arm like a lifeline. "I heard noises," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Scratching sounds, like something with claws trying to get at the house. And the smell," she shuddered. "God help me, the smell was awful, like something dead and rotting." Harold nodded grimly. "Started about an hour ago. First just sounds moving around out back. Then that stench rolled in with the fog. I got my gun and went to the back window, tried to see what was making all the racket." "And?" I prompted. His face went pale in the porch light. "Eyes," he said simply. "Two eyes glowing in the dark, watching the house. Too big to be a raccoon or possum, too high off the ground to be a dog. When I shined my flashlight toward them, they disappeared, but I could still feel something out there waiting." I felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on my shoulders. These were good people, honest folks who'd never caused trouble for anyone. If they said something was prowling around their property, then something was. The question was what, and whether it posed a real threat. "I want you both to stay inside and lock the doors," I instructed, moving past them toward the back of the house. "Keep your phone handy in case I need to call for backup." The backyard was larger than it had appeared from the front, stretching perhaps 50 yards before disappearing into the wall of forest. Harold had installed motion sensor lights along the edge of his property, but the fog was so thick that the beam seemed to be absorbed rather than reflected, creating an eerie twilight that was somehow worse than complete darkness. I swept my flashlight across the lawn, looking for tracks or other signs of disturbance. The beam revealed nothing but wet grass and the occasional garden ornament. A ceramic deer here, a decorative windmill there. But as I moved closer to the tree line, I caught the scent that Betty had mentioned. It hit me like a physical blow, so strong and foul that I had to fight back the urge to gag. The smell was death incarnate, not the clean death of something that had died naturally and been claimed by the forest, but the ripe, putrid stench of decay and corruption. It carried undertones of musk and something else, something wild and predatory that made every instinct scream at me to run. My flashlight beam snagged on something near the first line of trees, and I moved closer to investigate. What I found made my blood run cold. The remains of a deer lay twisted against the base of an old oak tree. But this wasn't the clean kill of a natural predator. The carcass had been torn apart with savage efficiency. Ribs cracked open like kindling, flesh stripped from bone in ragged chunks. The head was missing entirely, and the remaining limbs were bent at impossible angles, as if whatever had killed the animal possessed strength far beyond anything that should exist in these mountains. Around the carcass, the ground was churned into mud, and in that mud I could see tracks. They were like nothing I'd ever encountered, too large for a bear, too elongated for a mountain lion, with claw marks that gouged deep furrows in the earth. Each print was nearly 12 inches long, with what appeared to be 4 toes ending in talons that must have been razor sharp. A low growl rumbled from the darkness beyond my flashlight beam. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, vibrating through the fog like the voice of the mountains themselves. It was deep and guttural, but with an intelligence behind it that no animal should possess. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and every primitive instinct inherited from my ancestors began screaming warnings. I spun around, flashlight beam frantically searching the swirling mist. For a moment there was nothing but gray emptiness. Then, perhaps 20 feet away, 2 eyes reflected my light back at me. Not the yellow gleam of a nocturnal animal, but something darker, more malevolent. They burned like coals in the fog, unblinking, measuring. "This is Officer Garrett with the Willowbrook Police," I called out, my voice cracking slightly despite my efforts to sound authoritative. "Identify yourself." The eyes didn't move, didn't blink. They simply watched, and in that gaze I felt the weight of something utterly alien studying me like a specimen. My hand moved instinctively to my service weapon, a .38 special that suddenly felt as inadequate as a toy pistol. Then it emerged from the fog. The creature that stepped into my flashlight beam was something from mankind's darkest nightmares made flesh. It stood easily 7 feet tall on powerful hind legs that ended in those terrible claws I'd seen in the mud. Its torso was gaunt and emaciated, ribs showing sharply against leathery skin the color of old bone. The arms were grotesquely elongated, hanging nearly to the ground, ending in hands that were more like talons designed for rending and tearing. But it was the head that would haunt my dreams for years to come. A horrific parody of a wolf skull, elongated and distorted, with a jaw that had been stretched to accommodate row upon row of needle-sharp teeth. Those burning eyes sat deep in hollow sockets, regarding me with an intelligence that was utterly inhuman yet terrifyingly aware. It bared those terrible teeth in what might have been a grin, and the growl that emerged from its throat carried the promise of violence. Pure, unadulterated terror shot through my nervous system like electricity. Every rational thought fled, replaced by the singular imperative to survive. My service weapon was in my hand without conscious thought, and I squeezed off 3 rounds before the sound of the first shot had fully registered. The bullets struck center mass, and I saw them hit, saw the creature flinch and stagger backward. But instead of falling, it let out a roar of rage that shattered the unnatural silence and set every dog in the valley howling in response. Dark fluid too thick to be blood oozed from the wounds, but they seemed to have done little more than anger it. The thing lunged forward with speed that defied physics, covering 20 feet in what seemed like a single bound. I threw myself sideways, rolling across the wet grass as claws raked the air where I'd been standing. The creature's momentum carried it past me, and I scrambled to my feet, squeezing off 2 more shots as I backpedaled toward the house. One shot went wide, disappearing into the fog. The other caught the creature in the shoulder, spinning it around and buying me precious seconds. I could see the lights of the Whitaker house through the mist, could hear Harold shouting something from the back porch, but it seemed impossibly far away. The creature recovered its balance and came after me again, moving with the fluid grace of a natural predator. Its claws left deep furrows in the earth as it bounded across the lawn, and I could smell its rancid breath, could hear the wet sound of its breathing as it closed the distance between us. I made it perhaps halfway to the house before those terrible claws raked across my back, tearing through my uniform shirt and the flesh beneath like tissue paper. White-hot pain exploded through my nervous system and I stumbled, nearly falling. The creature's weight crashed into me from behind and we went down together in a tangle of limbs and claws and the overpowering stench of corruption. For a moment that lasted forever. I was certain I was going to die. The thing's claws were everywhere, slashing and tearing, and its jaws snapped inches from my face as I thrashed wildly beneath its weight. I could feel warm blood soaking through my shirt, could taste copper in my mouth, could see my own death reflected in those burning eyes. Then, somehow, my desperate flailing connected. My elbow caught the creature across its elongated snout, and it reared back with a snarl of pain and surprise. The momentary respite was all I needed. I rolled away, came up running, and sprinted for the house with everything I had left. Behind me, the creature's roar of fury echoed across the valley, a sound that would make grown men wake up screaming from nightmares for years to come. I burst through the tree line separating the Whitaker's lawn from the forest proper, my lungs burning and the taste of copper strong in my mouth. Behind me, I could hear the creature crashing through the underbrush in pursuit, its guttural breathing and the snap of breaking branches growing closer with each passing second. The fog swirled around me like a living thing, sometimes parting to reveal the house's lights ahead, sometimes closing in to leave me blind and disoriented. The wounds on my back felt like lines of fire, and I could feel warm blood soaking through my uniform shirt. Each step sent fresh waves of pain shooting through my body, but terror drove me forward with strength I didn't know I possessed. The creature was gaining ground. I could sense it closing the distance, could almost feel its rancid breath on the back of my neck. Harold Whitaker stood on his back porch, shotgun raised, his face a mask of determination and fear. "Get down," he shouted, and I threw myself flat against the wet grass just as the boom of his 12-gauge split the night air. The buckshot caught the creature's center mass, and it stumbled backward with a howl of rage that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. Dark fluid splattered across the lawn, but the thing remained upright, those terrible eyes now focused on this new threat. "Jesus Christ," Harold whispered, his voice barely audible over the ringing in my ears. "What in God's name is that thing?" I rolled over, bringing my .38 to bear, and put 2 more rounds into the creature's torso. The impact staggered it again, but it seemed more enraged than injured. Whatever this thing was, conventional weapons weren't going to stop it. The creature's head swiveled between Harold and me, as if calculating which target posed the greater threat. In that moment of hesitation, I could see its wounds more clearly. The bullets had definitely penetrated. There were ragged holes in its chest and shoulder, leaking that dark, viscous fluid that wasn't quite blood. But the injuries seemed to be closing, the torn flesh knitting itself back together with unnatural speed. "The house!" I shouted to Harold. "Get inside!" But it was too late. The creature had made its choice. It bounded toward the porch with that impossible speed, covering 30 feet in 2 leaps. Harold got off one more shot, the muzzle flash lighting up the fog like lightning, before the thing crashed into the wooden structure. The porch railing exploded into splinters, and Harold went down hard, his shotgun skittering across the deck. Betty's scream from inside the house cut through the night like a knife. I could see her silhouette in the kitchen window, hands pressed against the glass, watching in horror as her husband struggled to get back on his feet. The creature loomed over Harold, those massive claws raised to strike. Time seemed to slow as I watched that nightmare tableau, and I knew with crystal clarity that I was about to witness a good man's death. Unless I did something. Now, I charged across the lawn, emptying my revolver as I ran. The remaining 3 rounds struck the creature in rapid succession, spinning it away from Harold and toward me. Its roar of fury seemed to come from the very depths of hell, and when it turned those burning eyes in my direction, I saw something that chilled me to the bone. Intelligence. This wasn't just some mindless beast driven by hunger or territorial instincts. There was consciousness behind those eyes. a malevolent awareness that recognized me as more than just prey. It knew I was the one who had heard it, the one who had dared to stand against it, and it wanted me to suffer for that audacity. The creature stalked toward me across the ruined porch, moving with deliberate slowness now, savoring the moment. Its claws clicked against the wooden planks with each step, and dark fluid dripped from its wounds to stain the deck. I backed away, fumbling for the spare speed loader in my pocket, but my hands were shaking too badly to manage the delicate operation. Officer Garrett, Harold's voice weak but determined. Catch. His spare shotgun came sliding across the deck toward me, and I dropped my empty revolver to scoop it up. The weapon was a beautiful old Remington 870, well-maintained and loaded with what I hoped were high-powered shells. The creature paused, perhaps recognizing the new threat, or maybe just enjoying the fear it could smell radiating from me in waves. Its lips pulled back from those terrible teeth in what might have been a grin, and it made a sound that was almost like laughter, a wet gurgling noise that spoke of intelligence and malice and hunger all rolled into one. I raised the shotgun to my shoulder, trying to steady my aim despite the trembling in my hands. At this range, maybe 15 feet, I couldn't miss. But would it be enough to stop this thing? "Come on, you bastard," I whispered, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. "Let's dance." The creature's eyes narrowed, and it crouched low, preparing to spring. Its muscles bunched beneath that leathery hide, and I could see the terrible power coiled in its frame. When it moved, it would be too fast for me to react, too strong for me to resist. But before it could launch itself forward, Betty Whitaker's voice cut through the tension from inside the house. "Harold. Harold, are you all right?" The distraction lasted only a split second, but it was enough. The creature's head turned slightly toward the sound, and in that instant I pulled the trigger. The shotgun bucked against my shoulder like a living thing, and the muzzle blast lit up the night in a strobe of orange flame. At 15 feet, the pattern was tight and devastating. The creature was lifted off its feet and hurled backward into the yard, dark fluid spraying in a wide arc. But still it wasn't finished. The thing rolled over and began to rise, moving slower now but still far from defeated. Half its face had been torn away by the buckshot, revealing bone and sinew beneath, but those eyes still burned with undiminished hatred. It opened what remained of its mouth and let out a sound that was part roar, part scream of rage. I worked the shotgun's action, chambering another shell, and fired again. This time the creature went down and stayed down, its body convulsing in the wet grass. Dark fluid pooled beneath it, and for a moment I dared to hope that the nightmare was finally over. Then I heard the sirens. Distant at first, but growing louder. The cavalry was finally arriving. The sound seemed to penetrate the creature's consciousness, and it raised its ruined head, listening. Then, with movements that should have been impossible for something so badly injured, it began to drag itself toward the tree line. "Oh, no, you don't," I muttered, advancing with the shotgun ready. But before I could fire again, the fog that had been hovering around the edges of the property suddenly surged forward like a living thing, swallowing the creature in its gray embrace. For a moment I could see its shape writhing in the mist, could hear the wet sounds of its labored breathing. Then both sight and sound faded, and when the fog thinned again moments later, the creature was gone. 2 patrol cars screeched into the Whitaker driveway, their headlights cutting through the mist like searchlights. Officers Thompson and Martinez piled out, weapons drawn, shouting questions I couldn't quite process through the ringing in my ears and the shock that was beginning to set in. "What's your status, Garrett?" Thompson called out as he approached the house. I looked down at the shotgun in my hands, then at the dark stains on the porch where the creature had bled, then at Harold Whitaker, who was struggling to sit up against the ruined railing. "Suspected prowler," I heard myself say, the lies coming automatically. Turned out to be a bear, large male, probably rabid. It attacked Mr. Whitaker and myself before retreating into the woods. Even as the words left my mouth, I knew how inadequate they were. A bear didn't explain the claw marks that were too large and too precise. A bear didn't explain the tracks I'd seen, or the way the creature had moved, or the intelligence I'd witnessed in those burning eyes. But what was the alternative? Tell them I'd just fought a monster straight out of humanity's darkest nightmares. Describe a creature that shouldn't exist, that defied everything science and reason told us was possible. The fog was thickening again, rolling in from the forest to obscure the evidence of what had really happened here. By morning, any tracks would be washed away by the heavy dew. The blood, if it was blood, would soak into the earth and disappear. All that would remain were the memories of 3 traumatized people and a story so unbelievable that no one would ever accept it as truth. "Bear, huh?" Martinez said, playing his flashlight beam across the ruined porch. "Must have been a hell of a big one to do this kind of damage." "Biggest I've ever seen," I agreed, helping Harold to his feet. "We'll need to contact the Park Service, have them put out a warning. Thing's definitely dangerous." The lies came easier now, flowing like water to fill the spaces where truth was too terrible to speak. And as the other officers began securing the scene and tending to Harold's injuries, I found myself already beginning to doubt what I'd seen. Maybe it had been a bear. A large, aggressive male driven to violence by rabies or starvation. In the fog and darkness, with adrenaline and fear distorting my perceptions. Maybe my mind had transformed a natural predator into something supernatural. But deep down, in the part of my soul that still remembered what it felt like to be prey, I knew better. The creature was still out there, somewhere in the vast wilderness of the Great Smoky Mountains. Wounded, perhaps, but far from defeated. And sooner or later, it would return. The question was whether I'd be ready for it when it did. The next 24 hours passed in a blur of reports, interviews, and the kind of bureaucratic machinery that grinds into motion whenever gunshots are fired and blood is shed. I spent most of February 3rd at the hospital in Sevierville, where doctors cleaned and stitched the claw marks on my back while asking questions I couldn't answer truthfully. "These wounds are unusual," Dr. Patricia Chen observed as she worked on the deepest gash. "The spacing between the punctures is inconsistent with black bear claws, and the depth suggests something with considerably more strength than what we typically see in wildlife attacks." I lay face down on the examination table, feeling each tug of the suture needle, trying to construct a plausible explanation. "Could have been a brown bear," I suggested. "They get bigger than the blacks, more aggressive too." Dr. Chen paused in her work. "Officer Garrett, there haven't been brown bears in Tennessee for over a century. They were hunted to extinction in this region before World War I. The silence stretched uncomfortably, until I mumbled something about the attack happening too fast to get a good look at the animal. Dr. Chen finished her work without further comment, but I could feel her skepticism like a physical weight. Harold Whitaker was treated for cuts and bruises, a dislocated shoulder from his fall, and what the emergency room physicians diplomatically termed acute stress reaction. Betty hadn't been physically injured, but the hospital kept her overnight for observation after she suffered what appeared to be a panic attack severe enough to require sedation. Chief Morrison arrived at the hospital around noon, his weathered face grave as he reviewed the initial incident reports. We found a quiet conference room where he could debrief me away from curious ears. "Hell of a thing," he said, settling his bulk into a plastic chair that creaked ominously under his weight. "Bear attacks are rare enough in these parts, but one this aggressive?" He shook his head. "Park Service is all in an uproar. They're sending a team out this afternoon to track the animal." I shifted uncomfortably in my chair, feeling the pull of stitches across my back. "Any word on the Whitakers?" "Harold's going to be fine. Tough old bird. Probably tougher than either of us." Morrison lit one of his ever-present cigarettes, ignoring the hospital's no-smoking policy. "Betty's having a harder time with it. Keeps talking about eyes in the fog, strange smells, sounds that bears don't make." My chest tightened. Shock can do funny things to people's perceptions. That's what the doctors say. Morrison studied me through a haze of cigarette smoke. "Thing is, some of the details in your report are raising eyebrows. Bullet wounds on an animal that supposedly ran off into the woods. Damage to the Whitaker property that looks more like something exploded than anything a bear could do." I'd known this moment would come. Had been dreading it since the first responding officers arrived at the scene. The lie I'd told in the immediate aftermath of the attack had bought me time, but now that time was running out. "It was dark," I said carefully. "Fog was thick as pea soup. Everything happened fast." Morrison nodded slowly, but his eyes remained sharp and calculating. "TBI boys are taking an interest. Agent Sarah Walsh called this morning, wants to review the case files. Seems 3 missing persons and a wildlife attack in the same area within a month has got their attention. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation." My heart sank. State-level investigators would bring resources and expertise that our small department couldn't match. They'd have forensic specialists, crime scene analysts, Access to databases and laboratories that could piece together evidence I hoped would stay buried. We cooperating fully? I asked. Course we are. Got nothing to hide. Morrison's tone suggested he wasn't entirely sure about that, but I want you to walk me through it again, Garrett. Every detail you can remember. Something's not adding up, and I need to know what before the state boys start asking harder questions. So I told him the story again, sticking as close to the truth as I dared while omitting the details that would have gotten me transferred to the psychiatric ward. I described a large aggressive bear that attacked without provocation. I explained the extensive damage as the result of the animal's size and apparent rabies infection. I characterized my defensive shooting as necessary to protect civilian lives. Morrison listened without interruption, occasionally making notes in a leather-bound notebook that had seen better decades. When I finished, he stubbed out his cigarette and was quiet for a long moment. "You know what bothers me most about this whole situation?" he finally said. "It's not the bear attack itself. Mountain folk deal with dangerous wildlife all the time. It's not even the missing persons, though that's troubling enough. What then? It's the feeling that something's watching us," Morrison said quietly. "Last few weeks I've had this itch between my shoulder blades, like something's got crosshairs painted on my back. Other officers mention it too when they think I'm not listening. Hell, even the civilians are spooked. Gun sales at Murphy's have tripled. Folks are keeping their kids indoors after dark." I knew exactly what he meant. The same primitive warning system that had saved my life the night before was still active, still sending alarm signals through my nervous system. Even here in the hospital, surrounded by the mundane bustle of modern medicine, I found myself checking exit routes and watching shadows. "Could just be nerves," I suggested. "Small communities can work themselves into a panic pretty easily." Morrison gave me a look that suggested he wasn't buying what I was selling. "Maybe. But I've been doing this job for 27 years, Garrett. Seen plenty of situations where folks got spooked over nothing. This feels different." Before I could respond, there was a knock at the conference room door. A woman in a crisp business suit entered without waiting for permission. Mid-30s. Auburn hair pulled back in a severe bun. Eyes that missed nothing. "Chief Morrison? I'm Agent Sarah Walsh, TBI." She flashed a badge and identification in a practiced motion. "And you must be Officer Garrett. I'd like to speak with both of you about last night's incident." The next 2 hours were the longest of my life. Agent Walsh was thorough, professional, and relentless. She went through my statement line by line, asking for clarification on details I'd hoped would be overlooked, requesting specifics about timing and positioning that required me to construct an increasingly elaborate framework of lies. She was particularly interested in the ballistics evidence. "According to the responding officers, they recovered 6 spent shell casings from your service weapon," Walsh said, consulting a manila folder thick with reports and photographs. "That suggests you fired your entire cylinder. Can you walk me through each shot?" I described a running gun battle with an aggressive bear, explaining how fear and poor visibility had caused me to fire more rounds than were probably necessary. Walsh listened without expression, making occasional notes. "The hospital also treated you for what appear to be claw marks," she continued. "Dr. Chen's report indicates the wounds are unusual. The spacing and depth don't match known bear attack patterns." "I'm not an expert on bear attacks," I said. "Just knew something was trying to kill me." Walsh nodded thoughtfully. "The Park Service team found some interesting evidence at the scene this morning. Animal tracks that don't quite match any known species. Blood samples that are anomalous. And this." She produced a clear evidence bag containing what looked like a fragment of bone or horn, about 3 inches long, curved and yellowed with age. It had been broken off from something larger, and one end was stained with that dark fluid I remembered seeing leak from the creature's wounds. "Any idea what this might be?" Walsh asked. I studied the fragment, fighting to keep my expression neutral despite the chill that ran down my spine. Even through the plastic bag, the thing seemed to radiate a sense of wrongness, as if it came from something that had no business existing in our world. "Could be an antler fragment," I suggested. "Maybe the bear was feeding on a deer carcass when I interrupted it." "Possibly." Walsh returned the evidence bag to her folder. "Though our wildlife experts are having trouble identifying the species, the bone density is wrong for deer, elk, or any other ungulate native to this region." Chief Morrison had been largely silent during the interview, but now he leaned forward in his chair. Agent Walsh, what exactly are you suggesting? That we're dealing with something other than a wildlife attack? Walsh's smile was professionally neutral. I'm not suggesting anything, Chief. Just gathering facts. But I will say this: in 15 years with the Bureau, I've learned that when evidence doesn't fit expected patterns, it's usually because we're not asking the right questions. She closed her folder and stood, extending business cards to both of us. I'll be staying in the area for the next few days, following up on the missing persons cases. If either of you remember any additional details about last night, please contact me immediately. After she left, Morrison and I sat in uncomfortable silence for several minutes. Finally, he spoke. She doesn't believe the bear story. No, I agreed, she doesn't. Question is, what does she think really happened? I didn't have an answer for that, but I had a feeling we were going to find out soon enough. The official report listed the incident as a wildlife attack, probable rabies infection in a large male black bear. The Park Service issued warnings about dangerous animals in the area and temporarily closed several hiking trails. Harold and Betty Whitaker were treated and released, with follow-up counseling recommended for trauma-related stress. But the real story, the truth that I carried like a lead weight in my chest, remained buried beneath layers of official explanations and bureaucratic language. 3 people knew what had really happened in the fog that night, and we'd all agreed, without ever discussing it explicitly, that some truths were too dangerous to speak aloud. The creature was still out there, wounded perhaps, but far from dead. And as the days passed and life in Willowbrook slowly returned to its normal rhythm, I found myself watching the tree line during my patrols, waiting for the moment when those burning eyes would appear again in the darkness. Because deep down I knew this wasn't over. It was just the beginning. 6 months have passed since that night at the Whitaker place, and Willowbrook has settled back into its usual quiet rhythm. The missing persons cases were quietly transferred to a cold case file after the TBI investigation failed to uncover any actionable evidence. Agent Walsh moved on to other assignments, though not before leaving me with the distinct impression that she suspected more than she could prove. Officially, the case is closed. The attack on the Whitakers was ruled a wildlife encounter, and the Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation issued new guidelines for bear safety in areas adjacent to the national park. Warning signs were posted at trailheads, and park rangers increased their patrols of the backcountry areas where Ezra Thompson and Jenny Carlisle had disappeared. But for those of us who lived through that February night, nothing has been the same. Harold Whitaker recovered from his physical injuries within a few weeks, but the psychological scars run deeper. He and Betty sold their house in April and moved to Knoxville to be closer to their daughter. The last time I saw Harold, he was loading boxes into a moving truck, and when our eyes met across the driveway, I saw the same haunted recognition that I've been carrying ever since. We didn't speak what was there to say, but that moment of shared understanding said everything. Betty never fully recovered from what the doctors diplomatically termed acute stress disorder. She spent 3 weeks in a psychiatric facility in Knoxville, where they treated her with medication and therapy for what they assumed were hallucinations brought on by trauma. When she was released, she rarely left the house, and according to neighbors, she slept with every light in the house burning until the day they moved away. The official story satisfied most people. Bear attacks, while rare, weren't unheard of in areas bordering the Great Smoky Mountains. The missing persons were easier to explain as unfortunate accidents. Hikers who'd gotten lost in the vast wilderness succumbed to exposure or falls, their bodies claimed by the forest. It happens more often than people like to admit. But some folks weren't so easily convinced. Murphy Williams, who runs the general store, started carrying a pistol behind the counter and installed motion sensor lights around his property. Mrs. Henderson moved her evening walks from the quiet residential streets to the well-lit commercial district downtown. Even Reverend Hayes began ending his Sunday sermons earlier, ensuring his congregation could get home before full darkness fell. The change was subtle but pervasive, like a shadow that had fallen across the entire community. Parents kept their children closer. Teenagers stopped sneaking out after dark for romantic encounters in the woods. The hiking trails that had once been popular with day trippers from Knoxville and Chattanooga saw a marked decline in visitors. Willowbrook had always been a quiet town, but now it felt like a community holding its breath. For me, the changes were more profound and more personal. Sleep became elusive, plagued by vivid nightmares that left me drenched in sweat, and reaching for the service weapon I'd started keeping on my nightstand. In the dreams, I was always back in that fog-shrouded yard, facing something that shouldn't exist, feeling those burning eyes measuring me like prey. Sometimes I woke with the phantom smell of decay in my nostrils, so real I'd search my apartment for the source before remembering it was just memory playing tricks on my traumatized psyche. The scars on my back healed cleanly, thanks to Dr. Chen's skilled suturing, but they remained sensitive to changes in weather and stress. On humid nights when fog rolled down from the mountains, the old wounds would ache like arthritic joints, a constant reminder of that night when my worldview had been shattered beyond repair. I took to driving different routes during my patrols, avoiding the rural areas where forest pressed close to the road. When duty required me to respond to calls in those areas, domestic disturbances, property disputes, the occasional minor traffic accident, I found myself checking and rechecking my equipment, ensuring my weapon was loaded and my radio was working properly. The rational part of my mind insisted these precautions were unnecessary. Whatever that thing had been, it was gone now. Wounded, possibly dead, certainly driven far from human habitation by the encounter. The mountains were vast, thousands of square miles of wilderness where something could disappear forever. But the rational part of my mind had been overruled by something deeper and more primitive, the part that remembered what it felt like to be hunted by something infinitely more dangerous than myself. Sometimes, driving the quiet roads at night, headlights cutting through the darkness, I'd catch movement in my peripheral vision, a shadow among shadows, keeping pace with my patrol car just beyond the tree line. When I'd stop and shine my spotlight into the woods, there was never anything there, just empty forest and the reflection of countless watching eyes that belonged to deer and raccoons and other harmless creatures of the night. But the feeling of being watched never completely went away. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the department's consulting psychologist, diagnosed me with post-traumatic stress disorder following what the official reports termed a life-threatening wildlife encounter. She prescribed therapy sessions and anti-anxiety medication, both of which I accepted with the proper show of gratitude while having no intention of using either. How do you explain to a trained professional that you're not suffering from hallucinations or hypervigilance disorder, but rather from the perfectly rational fear that something inhuman is stalking the mountains around your town? How do you convince someone that your nightmares aren't psychological projection but accurate memories of an encounter with something that shouldn't exist? The answer is, you don't. You smile and nod and take the pills they give you, which I flush down the drain, and attend the therapy sessions, where I discussed my symbolic interpretation of the trauma. Meanwhile, you research. I spent my off-duty hours in the library, poring over old newspaper archives and historical records, looking for patterns that might explain what I'd encountered. What I found was disturbing. Every few decades, going back to the earliest European settlement of the region, there were reports of disappearances that followed similar patterns. People vanishing without a trace from areas near the national park. Livestock found mutilated in ways that didn't match known predator behavior. Occasional sightings of something large and unnatural moving through the forest. The Cherokee had legends about something they called the Wendigo. Not the ice creature of northern mythology, but something else. Something that had dwelled in these mountains long before humans arrived. A thing of hunger and malevolence that emerged from the deep forests during times of hardship to prey upon the unwary. Most telling were the cyclical nature of the incidents. Clusters of disappearances and strange sightings would occur over a period of months or years, then stop abruptly. Sometimes decades would pass before the pattern repeated, as if something was periodically awakening from dormancy, feeding, then returning to whatever dark place it called home. The last major cluster had occurred in 1967 to 68, when 4 people had vanished from the area under circumstances remarkably similar to what we'd experienced. Before that, 1943-44. Before that, 1921-22. The intervals weren't exact, but they were consistent enough to suggest something real and recurring, something that was overdue for another active period. I began to suspect that Ezra Thompson and Jenny Carlisle hadn't been random victims, but rather the beginning of a new cycle. The creature I'd fought had been testing human defenses, probing for weakness, preparing for a more extensive hunting season. The thought kept me awake at night, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds of the forest beyond my apartment window. Every creak of settling timber, Every rustle of wind through leaves, every distant animal call made me tense with anticipation, because I knew it was still out there. During the day, when sunlight filtered through the mountain valleys and the town went about its normal business, it was easy to convince myself that the whole nightmare had been an aberration, a one-time encounter with something that had since moved on to other hunting grounds or died from the wounds I'd inflicted. But in the pre-dawn hours, when darkness pressed against the windows and the familiar world seemed thin and fragile, I felt its presence like a weight on my chest. Somewhere in the vast wilderness of the Great Smoky Mountains, something ancient and hungry was waiting for the right moment to resume its predations. And when that moment came, I would be ready. I'd upgraded my personal arsenal, adding a .45 automatic and a 12-gauge shotgun to my collection. I'd practiced with both weapons until I could reload and fire in complete darkness, muscle memory taking over when conscious thought might fail. I'd studied the terrain around Willowbrook, identifying potential ambush sites and escape routes, trying to think like both predator and prey. Most importantly, I'd made peace with the fact that when the creature returned, not if, but when, I might be the only thing standing between it and the innocent people of this quiet mountain town. The thought should have terrified me. Instead, it brought a strange kind of peace. I'd looked into the face of ultimate predation and survived. I'd felt the weight of those terrible claws and lived to tell about it, even if the telling had to be wrapped in lies and misdirection. Whatever that thing was, it could be hurt. It could bleed. And if it could bleed, it could die. The next time we met, I intended to prove that theory conclusively. So I wait, and watch, and prepare. The people of Willowbrook go about their lives, secure in the belief that the danger has passed, that whatever threatened their quiet community has been dealt with by the proper authorities. They don't know that their real protector isn't the government or the Park Service, or even the police department as an institution. It's one damaged cop with too much knowledge and too many nightmares, standing guard against something that most people couldn't even imagine. But sometimes, in the deep hours of the night when the forest grows quiet and the fog rolls down from the mountains, I feel those eyes watching from the darkness beyond the tree line. Patient, calculating, waiting for the right moment to emerge from the shadows and resume the hunt that has been going on for far longer than human memory. When that moment comes, Willowbrook will need every advantage it can get, and I'll be ready to give it to them.